Okay, in this one we're going to build on where we started. In the last one we created our configuration for Doctrine, and so we're going to create a user entity. Little thing I thought about after I finished recording in that one was the composer JSON file. So the versions I'm using here, what I'd recommend is you just copy what I've got here, all of the same versions, because what you tend to find is students install their own versions, they have different versions than me, we get out of sync, and then you spend more time trying to debug their problems when they have compatibility issues. So if you stick with the versions I'm using here, and then as the project progresses, if say for example there's going to be updates, then we'll actually do it together. I'll update them as part of the lesson, and then we're all singing off the same song sheet at least. Choose high definition for the best viewing experience, and if you'd like to join a growing group of software developers and take your skills to a new level, all you need to do is subscribe, click the little notification icon, and welcome. Okay, so that bit out of the way, let's now go and create an entity. So we've got our autoloader mapping here. We're mapping the app namespace to the source folder. So we're going to go in the source folder and we're going to create another folder inside of there called entity, and then we're just going to create a PHP class called user. So let's go and do that now. So source, and then inside of there we want a folder called entity, and this is like a fairly common folder mapping. This is pretty much exactly the same as what you use when you use Symfony. You have a source folder, and inside of there you have an entity folder. And so we now need a user class. And by the way, don't worry, don't get too concerned that we're using things like Doctrine and thinking it might be a little bit over your head. Doctrine's quite a standard tool. Throughout your career as a PHP developer, you will come across it at some point. I'm going to show you the basics enough for us to use it in this one, but like I said in the last lesson, if you want to go deeper into it, either check out some of my lessons on YouTube, because I've done a few there, and also just go through the documentations, go through that tutorial which I showed you in the last lesson. Okay, enough of me waffling on. Now then, we need to have a look at our SQL, and then we'll copy the properties from there. So this is like how I'd work. I'd just look at it one step at a time, maybe do a model of how I'd like my tables to look, and then just copy that. So we're going to need these four properties here: ID, username, password, created at. Good idea is to just copy that, go down to here, create a comment, and just paste it in, and then at least we've got some kind of guide. Okay, properties need to be either protected or private. Okay, don't make them public when you're using Doctrine entities. So I'm just going to make all mine private. So private, and this is going to be ID. I'm just going to make a little bit of space here. Okay. Then we've got username, then we've got password, and then we've got created app. I'm going to go with camel case, and I'll show you how we can actually translate that to snake case for the database. Okay, and so now we have our properties. We now need to let Doctrine know to treat this as an entity, and so we need to pull in the mapping classes that we're going to need for this. The way you do this, and this is pretty standard, is we use something called mapping. Okay, and this comes from DoctrineORM mapping, and then you give it an alias as ORM. Again, this is standard practice. You'll see this anywhere where Doctrine is used in their documentation in Symfony projects. This is how you do it. Okay, and now we need to tell Doctrine, hey Doctrine, this user class, please treat it as an entity. The way we tell Doctrine to treat this as an entity is like this. So we add a doc block above the class. Just going to remove the default comments, and we'll stick with our own. So I type at, and then if I start typing entity, it should come up. And so if you see this here, ORM / entity, and that is Doctrine ORM mapping entity. That's what we need. Don't need to give it any arguments there. Now we have told Doctrine that this user class is to be treated as an entity. We'll tell it the table name because I've called the class user, which means I think that would default to calling a table user. However, we're going to go with users, I think, only because I've seen in the Doctrine documentation they use plural for their examples. It really doesn't matter. I think the split is 50-50. Half the people think it should be singular, the other half think it should be plural, and nothing standard has ever been agreed. But we're just going to stay in sync with what Doctrine does on their documentation, I think. So we'll call this users. And now that is, I've now told Doctrine treat this user class as an entity, and that the table it should map to should be called users. We now need to add annotations to each of our properties. And so ID, we need to let Doctrine know that this is the ID, i.e. the primary key. And the way we do that is simply at ID. So ORM ID. We don't need to provide it with any argument again. Then we'll say the column type. So we'll start typing column, ORM column, and type, and the type will be integer for this. Okay, as you see, I'm getting a bit of auto completion there. Then we need to tell it how to auto generate the values, and we just the default is for it to recognize that you're using SQL or PostgreSQL or Oracle, and it will use the default strategy for that vendor. So in MySQL, it will use auto-incrementing IDs. In Postgres and Oracle, it will use sequences. So quite clever. If you don't tell it to do it a particular way, it will just automatically choose what that vendor does by default. And what we're looking for is this ORM generated value. We'll go and look at this just to show you what I'm talking about. So final class generated value implements annotation. So these are all instances of annotation of the annotation. Okay, and so here are the different types of generators. Default is auto, as in automatically choose the strategy which your vendor uses, and so we're just going to stick with that default. Okay, good stuff. So that is the ID taken care of. Now we need to move on to the username, and the username is going to be a string, and so at ORM column, and then type will be string. Okay, perfect. And we can copy and paste that for password actually, because we're going to use the exact same thing there. Okay, created that. So the column type for this is going to be datetime. We're actually going to specify a datetime interface for this, and I'm using datetime interface in case we use a combination of datetime and datetime immutable. Okay, and so ORM column, and then the type is going to be datetime. Okay, and we also, because I'm using camel case here, but in the database I want it to be created underscore at. So we're going to say the name of the field in the database will be created at, like that. Okay, and so that is our properties done, and that is how you let Doctrine know that you want the user class to be an entity, you want this ID to be an auto-incrementing ID, you want the username to be a string, you want the password to be a string, and you want the created at field to be a datetime. Okay, perfect. Let's add some getters and setters now. Before that, if we think about when we create a user, we want, every time we create a user, we want to use the current date time to be used when it's saved in the database. So what we shall do for that is, in the constructor, we shall just say this created at equals new date. I'll go with datetime immutable. And now we're going to create our getters and setters. I'm using PHP Storm, so I can automatically create them if I hit Control and then Enter. it'll bring up this little generator menu here, and just there it says getters and setters. So I'm going to create them for all, hit enter, and so that's done for me. I'll just put my datetime interface type declaration in there, and then we'll go and just check that everything is okay. So everything is there. There's one thing that we do need to change. We don't need to set the ID. The ID will always be set by the database. But apart from that, our entity is looking good. Let's just go down here, get ID, get username, set username, get password, set password, get created at, and set created at. Okay, perfect. Now what we need to do is create that table in the database. So let's go over to the Doctrine documentation, and this is the command here. It says now call the Doctrine command line tool, and it's vendor bin Doctrine ORM schema-tool : create. So it's the same one that we ran in the previous recording, but this time we now actually have an entity which should be persisted to the database. So let's roll this with our fingers crossed, hit enter. Okay, so database schema created successfully. Ignore this message here. If you see that, that's not relevant to us at this moment. The good bit is this bit here, database schema created successfully. So I'm going to go over to Table Plus, and I'm going to give this a refresh. Okay, we now have a users table. Let's just go and make sure it's been created correctly. So I'm going to look at the structure. ID, auto incrementing, username, varchar 255, password varchar 255. All of them are not nullable, and created that is a datetime, and if you notice, it created it with the name that we specified. So far so good. Now let's go and create a user. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new recordings every few days. Details of my schedule can be found on the community tab of my YouTube channel homepage.